ნახავთ ბაღაში შეიძლება ახალი ეკონომიკური სკოლა საქართველოს პრეზიდენტი. ეს სკოლა აგერ უკვე მეცხრე წელია დაკავებულია თავისუფალი ბაზრის კვლევით და შესაბამისი ინფორმაციის გავსებებით. ჩვენი არის არასამთავრობო ორგანიზაცია და ჩვენი ფორმატი როგორც წესი არის სემინარები, ლექციები, კვლევები, თარგმანები და რაღაც კონსულტაციები თუ ეს მინუს ჭირდება. ეკონომიკურ თუ ბიზნეს აქტებს. ჩვენ უკვე პირველი შემთხვევა არ არის, როდესაც ჩვენი სტუმარი მოდის თქვენთან, ჯერ კიდევ მაშინ, როდესაც ESM-ის ფორმატში მუშაობდით, მაშინაც კი უკვე თანამშრომლობდით, და ამ პროექტს ალბათ გავაგრძელებთ, იმიტომ რომ ჩვენ ძალიან ბევრი სტუდენტი ყავს როგორც წესი წესასწაულები გვეყოლება და ისე მოხდა, რომ თქვენი ორგანიზაციის ხელმძღვანელთან საკმაოდ კოლეგიალური თანამშრომლობა გვაქვს, შესაბამისად გადაწყვეტეთ, რომ აი ეს პროაქტიულები ვიყავთ თანამშრომლობა. ჩვენ ძალიან ბევრი საინტერესო პროექტია გვაქვს, მეტად ხალხ ინტერესი ოქშაბას მე ბაქრიაში გვაქვს ასე რომ დაგუკვირდი პროგრამა გვაქვს, მის დაინტერესდებით, უბრალოდ ჩვენ ვებგვერდზე შეგიძლიათ შემოგზავნეთ და კონკრეტული ინფორმაციას იქიდან მიიღეთ. ჩვენი ორგანიზაციის ვებგვერდი არის NESGeorgia.org, New Economic School, აბრევიატურა პირველი სამიანსო Georgia.org. ძალიან მაგარია ჩვენი ორგანიზაციის ვებგვერდი. ჩვენ დაინტერესებული ვართ, რომ საქართველოს იყოს ეკონომიკურად თავისუფალი და ღირსეული ადამიანებით ასახული ქვეყანა. შესაბამისად ჩვენ ვცდილობთ, რომ ადამიანებს მიუღოთ განსხვავებული ხედვა, თანდათან კრიტიკული, თანდათან უცნაური, მაგრამ ეს იმისთვისაა საჭირო, რომ ადამიანებმა ისწავლონ აზროვნება და გამოვიდნენ რაღაც ჩარჩოდან. ჩარჩოდან გამოსული ადამიანი გაცილებით უფრო ნაყოფიერია შემოქმედების ფასადზე და ჩვენი ამოცანა ეს არის, აი პროვოკაციის შემოტანა გარკვეულწილად ამ აზროვნებაში. დღევანდელი ჩვენი სტუმარი არის ბატონი პეტერ მენცელი, ჩემს პეტრეს ვეძახით, თუნდაც მოსწონს ეს სახელი, ძალიან აქტიურად სწავლობს ქართულს. ის წარმოადგენს თავისუფლების ფონდს ამერიკოს Liberty Fund და ის დაეთანხმება ჩვენს მოწვევას ჩამოსულიყო საქართველოში, გარდა ამისა ჩვენ სომხეთში, აზერბაიჯანში, სლოვაკიაში ორგანიზებებს ჩატარებას, ჩვენ დიდი ხანია მეკობრობდა, მას დიდი ხანია უნდოდა ჩამოსვლა და მოვახერხეთ ამ საშუალებისა და ინტერესის შეცვლა. დაგეგმილი გვაქვს რამოდენიმე ორგანიზება ხვალ ჩვენთან ოფისში მთელი დღის განმავლობაში ეთნოგრაფიის სემინარები იქნება, შემდეგ ის მიემგზავრება სომხეთში, იქნება სემინარი, მე ბრუნდება ბაქურიანში ვაკეთებ სემინარს, მე აზერბაიჯანში ასე ვთქვათ, ძალიან დატვირთული პროგრამა გვაქვს. მას ჩვენ შევთავაზეთ თავისუფალი არჩევანი თუ რა ლექციები შეგვიძლია მას აიკეთა და მან მომზადდა თქვენი საინტერესო ლექცია არის თუ არა თავისუფლების კულტურა, როგორც ესეთი. მე არ მინდა თუ დაგაგარდინოთ, მე უკვე გიხარი ჩვენი ვებგვერდის სამართი, ძალიან მოხალისეები ვარ თანამშრომლები. ერთი თხოვნა მექნება, ani დამეხმარება ამ თხოვნის შესრულებაში, ფორმალური მხარეა, მე მჭირდება ხელმოწერები, ფორმალიზება სპეციალური და თუ არ შეწყვეტებით შემოსა. ეს ორი რაღაცის მჭირდება, თვიდა ორგანიზაციული ფორმალობაა, მაგრამ მეორე მხრივ, თუ თქვენი მიუთითებთ თქვენს იმეილს, ტელეფონს ჩვენ ყოველთვის შეგეხმიანებით, როდესაც ჩვენ ამის ნავიღებთ და თუ დაინტერესებით რა თქმა უნდა მოვუწევთ. დიდი მადლობა ესეთი დროებით მომეცით. ალბათ მეც ბატონ პეტერზე.
ბატონო, მადლობას მოვახსენებ ბატონ პარტას და ინიციატივას, რომელიც იქნა გამოჩენილი ახალი ეკონომიკური სკოლის მიერ, გულისხმობ ბატონი პეტერ მენცელის მოწვევას საქართველოში და კერძოდ თავისუფალ უნივერსიტეტში ჩვენ დღეს გვაქვს კარგი შესაძლებლობა მოვისმინოთ აღიარებულ კვლევას, რომელიც იკვლევს აქტუალურ საკითხებს დაკავშირებულს აღმოსავლეთთან, ისლამისტიკის სფეროს ფარგლებში და ამავე დროს იქ საკითხებთან, რომელიც აქტიურად წარმოადგენს არაერთი უნივერსიტეტის, არაერთი სამეცნიერო-კვლევითი ცენტრის კვლევის ინტერესის სფეროს. Today, our guest is famous professor Peter Mensel, who is a well-known scholar specialized in the Ottoman studies, the history of Osman Empire and Islamic studies, as well as political Islam, and at the same time he is famous visiting professor of the European universities and scientific centers, and it's an honor for me to announce the presentation of Professor Peter Mensel. At the same time, I would like to inform you that Professor Mensel is professor of the University of Utah and active speaker and participant of the conferences organized by the Property and Freedom Society. So I would like to invite the professor to begin the lecture. Thank you very much. Professor, may I invite you?
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately I'm late. I'm first time here, and it was a little bit difficult to find. I'm a representative of the German British Naumann Foundation for Freedom, and we are a political foundation, not neutral, the foundation of German liberalism, and we cooperate in Germany with Free Democratic Party. Free Democratic Party, maybe you have heard, is now in a government. We have several ministries, foreign ministry, economics ministry, and so on. And we are working in Germany and in more than 60 countries of the world, here in the Southern Caucasus, for more than 14 years now. And we are concentrating especially on the free economy and on international dialogue. That means the development of the economy and peace, these are our main topics. And this is also the reason why we have invited Professor Peter Mensel, who will today explain to us the culture of liberty. That means liberty not only for the economy, but liberty as a lifestyle, liberty as the content of our life, as a philosophical goal. Yeah, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
So we can begin.
Gmadot, Gamarjobat, Kartuli Ana Vitsi, I'm very sorry, Bodishi, so I'm going to have to speak in English, and I'll try to be as clear as possible. I want to again say thank you for that wonderful, very nice introduction. I should clarify something though. I'm no longer actually a professor at Utah State University. As of 2008, I'm a senior fellow with Liberty Fund. Liberty Fund is a non-profit educational foundation that's dedicated to researching the philosophical idea of a society of free and responsible individuals. So I'm continuing my own work in the history and political economy of the Ottoman Empire while I'm at Liberty Fund, but I'm also exploring some of my other ideas, other things that preoccupied me for a long time, and one of these is, as Professor John mentioned is the philosophical idea of liberty. Liberty as a kind of a philosophical problem. And that is the subject on which I'm going to be speaking today. So thank you very much all for coming. And I don't have a PowerPoint presentation. I'm a very old-fashioned kind of a man, I suppose. But I hope that my remarks will be interesting enough that I won't need to have a PowerPoint presentation. I should also point out that I'm speaking here today for myself, Peter Mensel. My remarks are not necessarily officially the remarks of Liberty Fund. My remarks do not officially represent Liberty Fund's position. One of the key features of liberalism, historically speaking, has been the idea of limited government. The idea that the state or the government is somehow at best a necessary evil, one might say, and that the state represents the main threat to individual liberty. And indeed, we were just speaking the other night about this, historically many liberals have reduced the role of the state to one thing, and that's the protection of private property. And by extension, many liberals see the protection of private property, or indeed the institution of private property, as the basis for all liberal thinking, or perhaps indeed the basis for liberalism itself. But I wonder if there are also other threats to individual freedom, to individual liberty, that do not necessarily come from government. In fact, it seems to me that certain cultures or cultural practices seem to promote, or on the other hand, maybe are hostile to individual liberty. So what I wonder, is there such a thing as a liberal culture, or a culture of liberty? And if there is, how can liberals support it? Or maybe a better way to ask this is, what are liberals to make of this problem? So what I'm going to do this afternoon is I want to suggest that there is actually such a thing as a liberal culture. But I also want to suggest, and by the way, this is kind of a work in progress. I don't have this completely all figured out, so I would welcome any of your comments or criticisms on this. But I'm going to suggest that there is actually such a thing as a liberal culture, but that the way to understand it is as being distinct from a liberal society. That a liberal culture and a liberal society are two separate things. They're related, certainly, and similar, but the way to understand both of them is to look at them each as a separate kind of subject of analysis. I also want to say that when I talk about culture here, or a liberal culture, I'm not talking about an ethnic culture or a national culture per se. I'm talking about something more broader and more theoretical, that certain ethnic or national cultures could partake of, but is not necessarily synonymous with them. I'm talking about a broader theoretical kind of concept. So let me now make two sorts of arguments. First, I want to argue that there is such a thing as a culture of liberty, and then I'm going to argue that there isn't such a thing as a culture of liberty, and then we'll see if we can somehow create a kind of synthesis from these two, or new thesis from these two positions. So first of all, let's see if we can make an argument that there is such a thing as a culture of liberty. As I started off by saying, I think that most liberals will agree that the government represents potentially a great threat to the rights of individuals, and of course, one of the most powerful of these threats is the threat that government represents to the right of private property, or the right of individuals to own property or individual property rights. But I wonder if there are other kinds of threats to people's freedom or people's rights that do not come from the government. For example, I think that most liberals, probably all liberals, would say that the government should not make laws that legislate people's sexual practices, or that the government should not make laws that discriminate against certain racial or ethnic groups. But what about cultural practices or cultural forces that do essentially the same thing? So let me tell you two short stories here. supposing that a homosexual man lives in a country in which he has complete political and social rights, according to the law. According to the laws of the state, he is completely at liberty to be a homosexual. There's nothing restricting that. But at the same time, the culture in which he lives regards homosexuality as a sinful and disgusting practice, and this person is shunned and ridiculed by all of his neighbors. They refuse to speak to him or associate with him or hire him in their shops or factories or otherwise employ him. So this person is legally free to be a homosexual, but is he really free? Is he a free person? Is he at liberty? The other story I wanted to tell along the same lines is supposing that, imagine a woman who lives in a country where she enjoys complete legal freedom. She can vote, she can go have a higher education, she can start a business, she can do any of those things legally. But the culture in which she lives regards these kinds of practices as strange, for a woman, I mean, to do these kinds of things as strange, abnormal, perhaps even somewhat dangerous. And her family and her neighbors and friends all try to discourage her from doing these things. They tell her that it's a bad thing to do. They say mean things to her. What about her? Do you think that this person is actually free? In what sense is she a free person? Again, she's not facing any legal problems from the state. This is all challenges to her actions, restrictions to her actions, presented by the culture in which she lives. So these people are legally free, but they're limited in their actions by their cultures. It has been said that a door is as solid as a wall unless one opens it. So both of these people are legally free to open this door, but until they open it, the door might as well be a wall to their freedom to express their will, to express their wishes. So maybe, according to these examples, maybe this suggests that real freedom involves not only the absence of legal limits to our actions by laws and the coercive power of government, but maybe also it involves the absence of cultural or social restrictions to our actions. And this was indeed the position of the famous English liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill, who I'm sure some if not all of you have heard. And in his famous book On Liberty, in the introduction to On Liberty, he wrote, he said, quote, "Protection against the tyranny of the magistrate, that is the power of the state, protection against the tyranny of the magistrate is not enough. There needs protection also against the tendency of society to impose, by other means than civil penalties, its own ideas and practices as rules of conduct on those who dissent from them, to fetter the development and, if possible, prevent the formation of any individuality not in harmony with its ways." It's a very strong statement. He's saying, in other words, not only do we need, as the liberals need, to guard against the power of the magistrate, of the government, to constrain people's activities, but society can be just as powerful and just as dangerous as in constraining people's freedom of action. From the same chapter, he wrote, quote, "The despotism of custom is everywhere the standing hindrance to human advancement." And one final quote, again from the introduction to On Liberty, "In proportion to the development of his individuality, each person becomes more valuable to himself and is therefore capable of being more valuable to others." So these statements and arguments encapsulate what most philosophers might think of as at the heart of the liberal project, namely individual autonomy, individual freedom. according to this idea, according to this vision of the liberal project, people can only be truly happy if they discover their authentic selves, their true selves. And the only way people can discover their authentic selves, the only way that people can engage in this project of individual self-discovery is if people are autonomous, if people are free. That is, people need freedom not only from the state, but also from any other kinds of constraints, from society or other people. They need freedom to discover and develop their authentic selves, their true selves. And only that way can people be happy. Now, many philosophers refer to this collection of ideas as comprehensive liberalism or ethical liberalism. That is to say, this is an idea of liberalism that's based on the belief that a good life, or that the good life, is an autonomous one. Or to put it another way, the only way to achieve the good life is to be autonomous, is to be free. Because that's the only way we can find out who we really are, to build an authentic self. So, what in this formulation that I'm making here, this argument that there is such a thing as a culture of liberty, what is it? What would a culture of liberty be? Well, I guess it would be, according to this, if we use John Stuart Mill as our guide in some of these ways I'm interpreting his writings, it would seem that a culture of a liberty, or a liberal culture, is one in which people should be as free as possible to discover their true selves, even if their actions seem repulsive or offensive to other people. It also seems to imply that a culture of liberty should be anti-customary, or against custom. That is to say, all other things being equal, a liberal culture should try to subject custom always to a very critical eye, if not completely ignore it. Ignore custom or customary approaches to morality as constraints on the free development of each individual. Okay, so there's my position outlining this argument that there is such a thing as a culture of liberty. So now I'm going to say that there isn't such a thing as a culture of liberty. So what sort of an argument can we make there? Well, this sort of an argument goes something like this. This sort of an argument says that culture, as such, is beyond the scope of liberalism. Liberalism has actually nothing to say about culture. Liberalism should concern itself, and it really ought to concern itself with just one thing. And that one thing is private property, the protection of property rights. And the construction of a political order in which the state is limited to the protection of the rights of individuals to their property. That's it. That is really the beginning and the end of liberalism. Now, this idea is actually a very old one, and a very interesting one, because the attractive part of this idea is that it's very clear about what liberalism should be about, what liberalism should be involved with, and also it sets property rights as the foundational core of liberal ideology, which, again, I think is crucially important, and it has historically been crucially important to liberals. Now, of course, this way of thinking about liberalism, saying that there isn't such a thing as a culture of liberty or a liberal culture, this doesn't mean that individual liberals can make judgments about culture or have opinions about culture. An individual person who calls himself a liberal, of course, can have an opinion about different kinds of social behavior or different kinds of cultural norms. For instance, they could, with our examples from the beginning of my remarks, an individual liberal person could approve or disapprove of homosexuality, or approve or disapprove of a woman starting a business or getting a higher education. But this really has nothing to do with liberalism. These kinds of attitudes that this person would have would come from some place else. This would be from some other universe this person is inhabiting. Maybe a set of religious ideas or philosophical position. But they're not part of liberalism as such. So this would say that there's no culture of liberty because liberalism is not concerned with the question of culture. That liberalism is agnostic, you could say, about the question of culture. It's interested only in the preservation of the institution of private property. And it believes that once this is achieved, once liberals have achieved the protection of the institution of private property and created a set of political and social institutions that respect private property, whatever comes out of that is going to be okay, no matter what the individual cultural components of the society might look like. Now, this formulation of liberalism that focuses on the limited state and the paramount right of private property has been called by some philosophers political liberalism. This is to distinguish it from this comprehensive or ethical liberalism that I mentioned earlier. So, we have these two different visions of liberalism on the table. This, what's been called comprehensive or ethical liberalism, and what's been called political liberalism. The one of them, the ethical liberalism, seems to imply, well, not imply, I guess actually seems to argue that there must be such a thing as a cultural understanding of liberalism. And political liberalism seems to imply that this isn't really on the table for liberals, that liberal philosophers need to actually concern themselves with this as liberals. They can be interested in this, but this is something beyond the actual liberal project. Now, let me, for the remainder of my remarks, see if I can somehow or other synthesize these two things, if we can square this somehow or other. It seems to me that the contention that liberalism has nothing to do with culture is very problematical, because it seems to me that the notion that the right to private property is the single most important right is itself a kind of cultural statement. It itself is a statement that's embedded somehow in a set of cultural understandings or beliefs. It implies this idea of political liberalism, that the only important thing with liberalism is private property. It implies and sets in motion all sorts of other ideas and beliefs which will influence an individual's behavior. So even though essentially at its root it might not seem like a cultural statement, it leads to what clearly are ideas or beliefs that have cultural implications. So it seems to me it is somewhat disingenuous to say that liberalism is not concerned with culture. So the argument over the existence of a culture of liberty, I think, fundamentally is the result of a kind of confusion of these two ways of thinking about liberalism, this comprehensive liberalism and political liberalism. And it seems to me actually somewhat, it seems to me clear that there's such a thing as a culture of liberty, and it really partakes of this description of comprehensive or ethical liberalism. A culture of liberty would be a culture in which the autonomous development of each individual person was seen as the highest value, and one in which that development would have as few constraints as possible. So let me restate that. I think that a liberal culture is a culture in which the autonomous development of each individual is regarded as the highest value, and one in which that development of each person would have as few constraints, as few limits as possible. So the problem of this, the problem of me saying this, of course, hinges on the implications for liberals, the implications of this statement. So, in other words, if this is true, if what I just said is true, then does that mean that liberals have a duty, not only a right, but a duty to force people to do that? If it's true that the vision of a good life, or if it's true that a good life can only be reached by this individual development, this autonomous development of each person, then don't liberals have a duty to try to force or help at least people to come to that kind of conclusion? Actually, let me make a stronger statement. Doesn't it imply that liberals have a right or a duty to force people to that? If this really is the highest end, if people can only really be happy by pursuing this kind of life. But of course, by saying that, we have a paradox, because liberals also believe against coercion. Liberals also believe that people don't have the right to coerce one another to do something. So, in other words, a comprehensive or ethical liberalism implies that there is indeed this culture of liberty, that is to say, one which condones the maximum amount of individual autonomy, and liberals believe this is necessary for living a good life. On the other hand, liberals also believe, especially these people who we might call political liberals, they also believe that each individual has the right to live in such a way as he or she pleases, right? Whether or not that lifestyle necessarily fits within this culture of liberty or ethical liberalism. So what's a way out of this paradox? Because we seem to have backed ourselves into a kind of philosophical corner. On the one hand, we have a vision of the good life that we, as liberals, let's just, for argument's sake, say that liberals believe that this is really the vision of a good life. And on the other hand, we're constrained by liberal ideology to try to force people to live that kind of a life. So a way out of this problem might be to recognize that there's another kind of freedom that overlays both of these, and that might be the most important one of all. And that is the freedom of conscience. And this is something that Pierre Bayle, a French philosopher, explored in the 18th century. Bayle argued that it's only by following the dictates of one's conscience that a person can be truly happy. In other words, the good life, or the happy life, doesn't necessarily come from leading this autonomous existence. It comes from following one's conscience, the dictates of one's conscience. A person has to be free to follow his conscience. And following one's conscience does not, of course, preclude the existence of a culture of liberty, right? A liberal person's conscience will probably induce her to live in that kind of a culture, what I was just describing as a culture of liberty. But I guess there are certainly other people whose consciences will lead them to no such conclusion. There are certainly other people whose consciences will urge them to say that following this autonomous kind of life and creating an autonomous life for oneself is actually very bad. That the way to have a happy life or a good life is in fact not to follow some kind of path towards individual self-discovery or the construction of an autonomous, authentic self. But some people's consciences might tell them that the appropriate way to live a good life is to follow the teachings of a holy book, say, or to follow a set of ancient customs or practices. So their consciences, in other words, will tell them to follow another kind of life other than that of one of liberty, or a culture of liberty. So what this suggests to me is that there's a distinction between a liberal society and a liberal culture. In other words, a liberal society is one in which different kinds of cultures will have to be allowed. A liberal society is one in which there is room for a liberal culture. That is to say, I'm not denying that there is such a thing as a liberal culture. I'm just suggesting that this is only one of many different kinds of cultural constructions that could be allowed in a liberal society. That's because a liberal society will have to be based on this respect of freedom of conscience, because ultimately it's only by following one's conscience that someone can really be happy. That if someone is forced to act against their conscience, they can't be happy, and they won't feel as though they're living a fulfilled life, even if we, as liberals looking from the outside, think that they're not living a fulfilled life. Now this seems to me a very, again, I'm still kind of working on the implications of this, because this still seems to me a very difficult kind of position to defend. Because what am I saying? What are the implications of what I'm saying? I'm saying that liberty means that, well, I'm saying that liberty, broadly conceived, right? It has to mean, it must mean, that a person has the freedom, an individual has the freedom, to example, to be, what? A hedonistic, drinking, party-going person, but also a person has the freedom to be a sober, God-fearing husband or wife. It means that a liberal society must have room in it for different kinds of cultures, for the culture of this party-going hedonist, but also the culture of this God-fearing husband or wife. It means that a liberal society must have room for atheist cultures and religious cultures, for meat-eating cultures and vegetarian cultures. It means that a liberal society has to even have room for cultures that hate liberalism. It's a very dangerous position, but frankly, I'm not sure I see any other conclusion. The only kind of culture, I suppose, that a liberal society, or the only kinds of limits on this that I can see, would be practices that actively use coercion, that actively use violence against other people, because this, of course, goes against the very heart of the understanding of the basic understanding of liberalism. A liberal philosopher named Chandran Kukathis, who's currently at the London School of Economics, has argued that political liberalism, and this is in a sense what we're back to, talking about political liberalism instead of this comprehensive liberalism. He has argued that political liberalism means that society has neither the right to interfere with a particular culture's potentially illiberal way of life, nor the duty to promote any particular culture. It means that a liberal society, in other words, needs to be, in a sense, agnostic about culture, even though individual liberals can pursue their own idea, their own cultural understanding of what makes for a good life. So I'm going to end with that. Thank you very much for your attention. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Professor. And I just want to mention that we are coming from the Soviet Union, and we know the meaning and we have understanding of individual culture, political culture. Of course, it's very actual for us. At the same time, I have the question about the Muslim world and individual culture. What's your opinion? How it's possible to imagine the individual culture in the Muslim world?
Well, that's a very good question. I have to think for a moment on this. I think that, of course, this is a very topical question. And I think that, personally, there is room in the Islamic tradition for this kind of vision. And in the 19th century, as I'm sure many of you are very well aware, there were a number of philosophers in the Islamic world, in the Ottoman Empire, but not just the Ottoman Empire, who were trying to use mill, actually, or this idea of this understanding of liberalism, and to graft this onto Islam, and specifically onto Islamic understandings of the individual. I might add that one point that Islamic liberals, Muslim liberals, frequently make, and again, I'm sure this will not be news to most of you here, is that in Islam there's no intermediary between the individual and God. So that this might be a way for Muslims interested in liberalism to explore this idea of individual dignity or the importance of individual rights?
Well, thank you. I remember I was in Saudi Arabia for 2 months ago, and I had the lecture, and the students were, all of them, Muslims, not girls. They weren't allowed to come to listen to me because it's the society which is closed, and according to the traditions and the cultural heritage, it is not allowed to for the students to come and all of them to attend the lecture. But they have the right to be in another room, in another conference room to listen to you. Well, it's very interesting and distinguished lecture, and I think that there are some questions. Any questions, please?
If I can just add one, if I may just add one thing. Bodishi. If I can just add one quick thing prompted by your question. In this kind of understanding of a liberal political society, a liberal society that I laid out, the only actual interference in a person's life or the person's culture would have to be guaranteeing one right, and that was the right of exit. That people would, in this kind of liberal society I'm describing, the only actual time that society would interfere in the rights of what any person was doing is if that person were prohibited from exiting the culture in which he or she were living. So in other words, if we can imagine a kind of society, and again, this is based very much on Koukakis's thesis, but if we can imagine a kind of liberal society in which there are many different kinds of cultural groups all existing. Some of them are liberal, some of them are illiberal, some of them are Muslims, some of them are Christians. All of the society, all of the different people in that society would have the duty to leave those other people alone unless someone was being prevented from leaving. If someone was trying, the right of exit, in other words, is the crucial right to make this kind of a society work. But interestingly, it seems to me that the argument is that's the only one. That this kind of a society could work, and it could guarantee the freest possibilities for people to live in the kind of culture in which they could follow the dictates of their own conscience, so long as the only right that was observed across the board, that all of the different cultures agreed upon, was the right of exit. But that was prompted by your remarks about this particular, very closed kind of society. Yes, right.
It's very, very personal discussion. Professor, how do you think? Is there any country where there is liberal society now at the moment?
I'm not sure that there's any country right now that has this kind of society I'm describing. I think certain countries come closer or farther away from it, but I don't think that this kind of society exists. And the reason is, I think, is that is because of a kind of confusion between the goals, I guess, of liberalism. It seems to me that there are two different poles currently. One we might call multiculturalism, which says that we are obliged, me, you, Professor Johan, we are obliged actually to embrace all different cultures and regard all of them as wonderful and great and fine. And the other pole, I guess the other extreme, is to say that we have, even if you can say as liberals, we know what a good society is, and so we're going to enforce it. We're going to force people to live in a particular sort of way. So what I'm saying is, this kind of a vision of a liberal society is neither of those things. Because this is not saying that I have to really love or even respect some other cultural constructions. All it's saying is, as long as this other cultural unit allows this right of exit, I ought to, as a liberal, I ought to tolerate them. It also, I think, implies that, it implies that I'm at liberty to argue with them. I can point out, perhaps, that problems with what they're doing, or ways in what they're doing may be counterproductive, or have negative consequences. But I shouldn't coerce them. Personally, certainly, I should certainly not use the coercive power of the state to get them to act one way or another. But I should also not personally try to coerce them. But this, I think, is a little bit finer line, whether arguing with someone or maybe calling someone derogatory names, if that's a kind of coercion in and of itself. And I'm not sure about that. But that's a long answer to your very succinct and interesting question.
One more question, please. What's the difference, in your opinion, between liberals and libertarians?
Yes, I'm actually was using those more or less interchangeably here in these remarks, but they are I think different. I think libertarianism is a narrower understanding of liberalism, one in which a particular understanding of cultural actions is more important than what I'm trying to describe here. I might say, and of course this question, as I'm sure you know, is really freighted with all sorts of different kinds of problems and interpretations. But I might say that a libertarian is a liberal who believes or lives as, according to this ethical or comprehensive liberalism. Does that answer your question?
To some extent.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have two small questions, and at the risk of questions being too broad. So the first is, how far do you think from the times of John Stuart Mill the human race actually approached kind of this human society, sort of the liberal society? And you mentioned the possible threat, the possible pitfalls of kind of like excessive liberalism, of people becoming too hedonistic or like obsessed with like instant gratification. And do you think the human race is mature enough to meet this liberal society when it comes?
You might also have something to say. But let me take a stab at answering this question. I think actually that the ideas of John Stuart Mill have grown and become very important since the time he was alive. I think the whole reason that places like this exist and that the New Economic School exists and that we're here even talking about these things show how important these questions are. I think that in terms of your other question, I'm not sure I was exactly saying, I wasn't trying to pass any value judgments on this kind of hedonistic lifestyle. I was just saying that that's one kind of culture that a liberal society would need to allow. And as far as whether or not people are ready for this, I think that's a question that can be solved in the context of a liberal society. The readiness to live kind of a wild lifestyle like that, I guess is determined by the extent to which a person can actually be a functioning, responsible, civil person while living that way. Do you know, am I being clear enough? That I don't know if there's a kind of a one-size-fits-all determination for this. I think there are certain people who can function in this kind of a personal set of personal mores or ideas than other people who cannot function.
Maybe,
Sure, please.
I'm not a philosopher, and I would like to answer to your very interesting question on the basis of political pragmatism. Yeah. Also, what you are asking is mankind mature enough for the liberal society? One can formulate in another way. Does mankind need, or most of the people, do they need guidance? Yeah. Do they need guidance by a special group, or do they need guidance by the state? And then I would like to ask you, it's a rhetorical question, who should give this guidance? And we have had many cases in history where we had such guidance. In Germany, we had a great leader, you know. The only problem was, and is in many cases, that this guidance goes into false direction. Because nobody, not a small group, not the state, is developed enough to make the decisions for the individuals. And there's another issue. If we are not mature enough, maybe we have to live like we always have lived, so by tradition. This was the way people have lived until 500 years ago. But what progress they have made? The progress was only made when we had free choice. You know, when a young man and a young woman from different clans, Shakespeare, love each other, and their clans hate each other. This is the first step of emancipation of mankind and a way forward in this future we would like to have as the liberals.
Yes, thank you. Because I think that's what I was driving at as well. Is that I think that the determination on how to live must be an individual choice, because no one else knows. No one else has the knowledge for what can make a person happy. And this comes back to Pierre Bayle again. This idea of the conscience. The freedom to follow one's conscience is being important. So maybe someone, the dictates of one's conscience would indicate that that person doesn't feel right about living a certain way or behaving in a certain way. And I think that liberals ought to respect that.
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks again for coming. My question, I guess, is definitely more geared toward the post-Soviet era that we're in right now, and the struggle to become developed, or that the theory of being a developed country in that sense, not only economically but also culturally. Do you think globalization, international business, do you think that, in a sense, could almost become counterproductive in forcing entire countries to adopt something completely different, or adopt ideas that may not necessarily be embedded in their culture? And could this almost be, you know, an act of coercion that you have to change certain aspects to become developed?
That's a very interesting question too, and I think again, Dr. John, as an economist, will have some good things to say about some interesting input on that. But let me, if you don't mind, I'd like to see if I can say this. I think globalization is a much maligned force, actually, because globalization, I think, is really a way that leads to material prosperity. And the more prosperous a society is, it seems to me, the more opportunities different people will have. So I think that to the extent that different people's cultural ideas are challenged by globalization, what one is really saying that those cultural ideas are challenged by economic change or economic development, right? But if that's the case, then it could be any kind of economic development. It could be economic development inside the country that has nothing to do with globalization. So in other words, any sort of economic change is going to challenge a person's cultural beliefs. So I think that, in other words, whether this economic change is coming from internal developments or it's coming from globalization, I'm not sure is that important. In other words, it's the same kind of force. Now, of course, economic change does indeed challenge people's cultural ideas and beliefs, but I'm not sure that that's exactly a bad thing. Again, I was saying that as long as the society, and this may be mixing a couple of different types of units of analysis here, but I was saying as long as society does not actually coerce people to change their cultural practices, I'm not sure that there's anything wrong going on. If people can be exposed to some other kinds of ideas or some other ways of doing things or some other behaviors, I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, so long as they're not actively being coerced by a state or another group. But again, my key point here, and I think this is a problem with critics of globalization, is that what really seems to be the point of criticism, when one breaks it down, really seems to be economic change. So if one thinks about it that way, it's irrelevant whether the economic change is because of being, I think, become part of the world market, or whether the economic change is a result of endogenous factors. Would you agree?
Yeah, certainly. I agree, and we only should exclude to force other countries by military means or by economic pressure or by whatever other kind of force to change their culture. But what we cannot do, we cannot close down modern information technology. It is not possible to say from tomorrow Google will be no longer allowed, or we will shut off the internet. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's a quite actual problem in China at the moment, not only. So, and then everybody can make his own choice, and this is not forcing. And of course, nobody will be able to stop this process of globalization. Nobody will be able, in the long run, this is my personal conviction, nobody will be able to save the nation state in the very long run. It has maybe its task for the next 100 years, maybe 200 years, but not forever. And here in the Southern Caucasus, you know that, yeah, there were many small villages which had for hundreds of years, they had their own culture. And it was practically a big crime of a girl from this village to marry somebody from the other village. And there were hostilities for decades. But where it is, it does no longer exist. We in Germany, we had until 1871, we had so many small states, yeah? And there were a lot of, even there were German war, yeah, where we have all fought against each other. Where? No. Today we have Europe. Tomorrow we will have the world.
Well, please.
To continue the previous question, do you think it is possible to develop liberal ideas in poor society, or to create some individual autonomous isn't possible if you have some at least platform? And my other question is about post-Soviet countries. I know that you are a specialist of Islam world, but I'd like to listen to your opinion about post-Soviet countries, because I think here is different phenomenon, absolutely. And speaking about Georgia, now we have different groups, multicultural groups. They have really different values. Some people are free, some women are free, some women are not. Even during Soviet Union, Georgians were famous for breaking rules of property and creating private property. And some people are used to have private property, and so on and so on. And by your description, this means that we have liberal society, but I don't think that we have it. And what do you think, what's the main
Well, you have two questions actually, but maybe somehow related. One of them, if I understood you correctly, is how can a person develop this kind of autonomous, liberal self if he or she is very poor? And then the other question was the prospects for liberal society in the post-Soviet world. I think, let me see. I think that actually that they may be somehow connected, because the possibilities for developing this this sense of self, I think, can be. I don't think they're necessarily constrained by poverty, but liberalism, the economic forces of liberalism, tend to enrich a society. So, to the extent that a society adopts liberal economics, it will become wealthier, and then those people then will have the opportunity to develop this liberal project. I also might say that I'm not sure that this is sort of a relative question about poverty or impoverishment. How poor does a person have to be before he or she can develop this kind of this set of liberal understandings or liberal ideas? I have a feeling actually that I'm not sure that it really constrains a person that much in terms of developing the possibilities of developing a sense of self. But again, I think that they're connected. I think that a liberal economic culture, I think, tends to enrich people, and I think that does assist, say, or make easier the development of this liberal project. But I'm not sure that it's essential for it. I'll have to give that some more thought. As far as your other question is concerned, based on what I've seen in the times I was working and studying in the Yugoslav countries and Bulgaria, and my visit here to Georgia, I'm very optimistic about the possibilities of liberal society in post-socialist or post-Soviet countries, precisely for the reason that you suggested, that I think that people in post-socialist or post-Soviet countries have seen what happens when the ideas of liberalism are abandoned, and maybe that creates a deeper sense of urgency or a deeper understanding, perhaps, in how important these ideas are that exist in Western Europe or North America. So I think I'm actually optimistic about the possibilities of liberalism in the post-socialist and post-Soviet worlds. And as a matter of fact, the point that was embedded in your question, I think, was also very interesting. I think the very fact that you do have different cultural spaces, I guess, here in Georgia, is a good example of what I was talking about. That perhaps this is, and again, to this gentleman's comment, I don't actually believe that this society I imagined here actually exists any place in the world. But it seems to me that from what I've seen in Georgia, it seems like that it's a very promising movement in that direction. You want to add? Okay.
Well, please.
Does there exist such a notion as a liberal reform? Because it's kind of like a contradictory term. Because reform is something like what you said. We know what a good society is, and we want to force it to live some way, one way or the other. We want to do it. But liberal reform. How does it fit?
That's an excellent question. And as it happens, I was with my work at Liberty Fund, I was putting together a couple of conferences, one in Prague and one in Sofia, on this very question, because it embodies a paradox about how these were specifically asking about the transformation of the socialist transition. And one of the conference in Prague has already taken place. One in Sofia is still being organized. But one of the questions, or one of the answers that we suggested, and we didn't actually answer the question, but one of the ways that we thought about answering the question would be coming back to the idea of property rights. That if the reform is based on private property and establishing clear title to private property and the right of private property, that might be all that's necessary. And that also is potentially non-coercive, because it doesn't necessarily involve taking anything from anyone except the state. It means releasing the state ownership of the enterprises or capital. So that was a way that we suggested that a reform could be both liberal in the sense of being non-coercive, but also working towards the establishment of a liberal order. The other thing that, the other aspect of that postulate that appealed to me was that it had very little to say about the actual organization of society. It suggested that once the institutions of private property were in place, different kinds of social or cultural understandings or structures could grow out of that. And I also found that to be very appealing. But that's a very good question, and I'm not sure that we've unpacked all of the implications of this, but I would suggest that that might be one way of thinking about a non-coercive kind of reform.
Yes, I agree, but maybe I can add something, because I have lived myself for a long time under communism, so I know what it is. And the problem in communism is that everything you try to reach in some way by the collective and by force. You are talking about coercion. And here, this we have to solve. In Russian, it was always said, "Если не хочешь, составляй." Now, this is not the way. And the leaders, communist leaders, they even could not imagine that there is a society which develops by autonomous individuals, and there is organized by property. Here I also 100% agree with you, organized by property, a spontaneous order. Spontaneous order. This was absolutely incredible for communists. And this we have to understand. And this we have to create. This is the reforms. And you may know from your parents or from whoever has lived in the Soviet Union, there was such a word, самодеятельность. Они занимаются самодеятельностью. This was something very, very bad. But we live from that. We live from that people have initiative by themselves.
Well, thank you. Please. Yes. Go ahead. So
There was one question about the role of poverty. I'm just curious what you think about the role of awareness in the
role of what?
Awareness.
Awareness.
How can it affect this whole process?
Awareness of poverty?
No, awareness in general.
Well, I see what you're asking. So in other words, a very poor person won't be aware of the different cultural offerings or...
Poverty was just an example. I mean, you can skip the whole part and just asking in general, a separate question about awareness. What can the role of, I mean, let's say this way, if people are more aware,
Well, I think it's very important, of course, and I think that actually these things tie in, right? This question about the question of globalization, I think, ties in with this as well, because again, it makes people more aware of different possibilities, different ways of living, different ways of answering questions. So I think it's very important. You know, on this question of poverty again, though, the key here, again, to come back to a liberal basis, is that some liberals historically drew the conclusion that a person could only be free to carry out a liberal project if he's somewhat wealthy or has a basic level of subsistence. And this is something that in liberalism that's a very contentious issue. But I would only say that a liberal has to ask, giving someone money or assistance means that money has to be taken from someone else. So the liberal has to draw a kind of calculus about coercing someone else to get the money to give to somebody who usually the state thinks deserves it. And this, I think, is a problem in liberal thinking. But to get back to, it occurred to me when you brought this up. But again, on awareness, yes, I think it's very important. And again, I think it's something that can be aided by the forces of globalization and economic growth. But I sense I'm not answering your question.
I think that it can help you in making correct decisions.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's true, and that was certainly the opinion of most classical liberals, like Mill, for instance, who very much agreed, who argued that that one of the crucial liberties is the liberty to express one's opinion, and he said that was really the way in which everyone in society, by becoming more aware of different opinions, could become a better person, because it would. Yes, certainly. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
First of all, I would like to thank you for the delightful lecture. I think this was a lecture that touched the deepest roots of liberalism that I've ever listened to, and also for the style of the delivery where you actually put on the table both views very neutrally. And that liberal approach to you, without passing any judgment, lets me be kind of brave and bring out the question of integrity, probably a sacrilegious question for any liberal that I've been having in my liberal project. And let me try to formulate it clearly for the first time. You know, you made me think that maybe culture is an immutable property of any group of people, of societies. It kind of arises spontaneously. And you've given some very sad examples of culture in action. But of course there are millions more examples when culture makes people prosper, and culture makes people be happy, make sense of themselves and their surroundings. And here comes the sacrilegious part. What if governments are also an immutable property of humankind? After all, I can hardly name any large group of people, any state that hasn't come up in one way or another of this construction. If this is so, maybe we liberals should also kind of think of governments as not necessarily evil, but as an immutable thing that arises spontaneously. And when we say that we cannot interfere in the natural way of processes flow, we can also say, well, the government are also part of these natural processes. And again, as you said, I'm not at all sure whether what I'm saying is a legit kind of liberal question at all. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you for your kind words, first of all. Again, I think there's two parts to your question. And one of them is about culture. And this is actually something that liberals, again, have, and have lots of discussions about. This may also be an example of how liberals and libertarians might differ. Because I think that libertarians and many liberals would be on the side of saying that culture is actually the default position. You know, the basic approach to culture should be to challenge it, always. Maybe a classical liberal position to culture could be to say, leave it alone but examine it. Examine it first with a neutral attitude, and then determine whether or not there seems to be any utility to it. So there's a story that a colleague of mine tells about her, if you'll permit me, a story my colleague of mine tells about cooking a kind of a roasted meat in a pan. And she always cuts off the bottom part of the roast and puts it in the side of the pan. And her daughter asked her one day, "Why do you do that, Mommy?" And my colleague thought for a minute and said, "I don't really know why I do that. That's what my mother cooked it." So she said, "Let's call Grandma and find out." So they called up her mother, and she said, "I'm not really sure. I think that's the way your mother taught me how to do it. I don't know." So it happened that her mother was still alive. So they called her up, and she said, "Why did you always cut off that bottom part of the meat and the roast and put it on the side of the pan?" And the great-great-grandmother said, "Well, because my pan was too small." So sometimes these cultural practices have these roots that have a certain, a real actual meaning, but that meaning becomes redundant or just kind of vestigial over time. So that's perhaps a somewhat benign example, but I guess what it suggests is that cultures can, I think, offer people certain kinds of guides. But a liberal approach to this, and I think this was also Mill's approach, because that quote I read from Mill, there are other things he says in On Liberty, where he suggests that cultural practices should not be simply jettisoned out of hand. They should be scrutinized, but they shouldn't just be thrown out just out of hand. Now the other question that you asked is, well, if culture seems to be something that arises somehow spontaneously, and that maybe can have good things about it, maybe we can say the same thing about government. Well, this, I guess, involves us in a discussion of theories of the origin of the state, or the origins of government. And there are different kinds of these theories, and I suppose, depending on which one ascribes to, it will lead to the answer to your question. But I think most liberals would probably adopt something like a Lockean sort of story about the origin of the state. That the state arises, I'm not sure spontaneously is the exact word, it arises somehow or other as a human construction to solve a particular coordination problem in human activity. And that the one legitimate action of the state is to protect people's property. Then when it ceases to do that, it loses its legitimacy. So I'm wondering if that maybe answers part of your question. If there could be developed some other way, I guess, of guaranteeing property rights, then maybe the state wouldn't be necessary. Another very compelling theory for the origin of the state is the state as organized criminal activity. Is the state emerges from it emerges when roving groups of robbers and bandits decide that it's easier for them, instead of attacking a village every year and then going away, it lowers their transaction costs just to stay in the village and extract wealth on a regular basis from the producers. So that's a different theory for the origin of the state. But again, I think it has similar implications. It means that the state is not necessarily spontaneous or natural, perhaps, in the way that culture might be, and that there might be ways of thinking about limiting, or maybe, big maybe, in the future, if these kinds of questions of transaction costs or knowledge costs could be solved, maybe eliminating it altogether. So I hope that addressed your very interesting and profound question. Did you want to speak to that?
Well, so thank you, Professor. It's so interesting and distinguished lecture for the lecture, and I just want to say that there are so many cultures in the world. We speak about Georgian culture, about Turkish, Persian, and also the cultures are united. For instance, we say the Near Eastern culture, or the culture of Asia Minor, or Far Eastern culture. So it may be said that these cultures also, they may be understood as property, yes? Yes, and I think that the projects, especially dedicated to the dialogue between cultures, must be mostly financed and supported by the foundations and governments. So thank you very much for your so interesting lecture, and let me express my gratitude by the name of the students and professors and society members who attended your lecture today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.